If you love the stories of how the world's most important books came to exist, the circumstances, the desperation, the specific human lives that produced them, subscribe to Page and Flame. New stories every week. Cervantes' own account, in the preface to Don Quixote, says, "For what could my barren, uncultivated genius produce but the history of a lean, dried-up, whimsical son, begotten in a prison, where every dismal sound, every doleful accident, has its proper dwelling?" He was being self-deprecating, as was conventional in the prefaces of the period. But he was also telling the truth. The specific conditions of the prison at Seville, the people he shared it with, the debtors and minor criminals and confidence men and dispossessed farmers, gave him material. The Spain he had been traveling through for years as a tax collector, arguing with villages about grain they didn't want to surrender, had given him a landscape. The plains of La Mancha, the windmills, the inns, the roads. What he did with that material was something entirely new. Don Quixote, the full title is The Ingenious Gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha, tells the story of Alonso Quixano, a minor gentleman of 50 who has read so many chivalric romances that he has gone quietly mad and decided he is a knight-errant. He renames himself Don Quixote, recruits a local farmer named Sancho Panza as his squire, and sets off on adventures. The joke, at first reading, is that he is delusional. He attacks windmills because he believes them to be giants. He mistakes inns for castles, flocks of sheep for armies, and puppets for real people in distress whom he must rescue. He is consistently humiliated by reality. But Cervantes does something with this joke that transforms the book into something else. Sancho Panza, who begins as the practical man of reality to Quixote's dreamer, gradually comes to believe in the adventure anyway, not because he has gone mad, but because something about Quixote's willingness to see the world as he wants it to be becomes, slowly, its own kind of sanity. And when, at the end of the book, Quixote recovers his reason and renounces his delusions, it is not presented as triumph. It reads like loss. Cervantes was satirizing the chivalric romance, a genre he found ridiculous and culturally harmful. But he was doing something else too, asking what we lose when we give up the ability to believe in something the world has decided is not there. Don Quixote was published in two parts, the first in 1605, the second in 1615. Between the two parts, something strange happened. An anonymous writer published a fake sequel in 1614, a continuation of Quixote's adventures that Cervantes found fraudulent and artistically offensive. His response was to incorporate this in his own second volume. Characters in Part 2 of Don Quixote have read Part 1. They have heard of Don Quixote. They know his story. In one scene, Quixote himself reads the fake sequel and is furious at its inaccuracies. He is a fictional character arguing about the accuracy of other fictional accounts of himself. This was not done again in literature at scale for another 300 years. It is, in miniature, the kind of metafictional games that writers like Borges and Nabokov were celebrated for in the 20th century. Cervantes did it in 1615, apparently because he was annoyed about intellectual property. Cervantes died in 1616, one day after completing his last novel. He died in poverty, as he had lived most of his life. His grave was lost, the convent where he was buried moved, records were incomplete, and his remains vanished. They were rediscovered under a Madrid convent in 2015, nearly 400 years after his death. Don Quixote is regularly listed on polls of the world's greatest works of literature. It topped a poll by the Nobel Institute in 2002, which asked 100 writers from around the world to name the most important work of fiction ever written. The man who wrote it was a failed playwright, a captive slave, a tax collector, a convict. He wrote it in prison. He didn't know it would be the first modern novel. He thought he was writing a satire of a genre he disliked. It turned out to be the beginning of everything. If the unexpected lives behind the books that change the world are what keep you awake, subscribe to Page and Flame. There are more stories waiting.